Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Hello, reasonable people, and welcome to our December Bay Area Skeptics SkepTalk. We're really fortunate tonight. We have what I would only describe as a skeptic talking this evening. Dr. Craig Foster is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Northshore School District in Bothell, Washington. In that role, he evaluates student development in critical thinking. So he literally is a man who watches skepticism and the development of skepticism. Dr. Foster was previously a psychology professor at the United States Air Force Academy and the State University of New York in Cortland. Dr. Foster is a CSI Fellow and the author of the Time Warp column in Skeptical Inquirer. In that column, he looks at old Skeptical Inquirer articles and evaluates how we're doing. And his talk tonight is going to be on whether we're winning this battle with trying to educate the public in skepticism. Welcome, Dr. Craig Foster.
Thank you so much. I was just so delighted to be invited to speak to Bay Area Skeptics, a group that I know has such an incredible history. And I feel very fortunate that I will be talking about the history of skepticism. And I hope to do the history of the Bay Area Skeptics justice with my talk. And as Jay said, what I'm going to talk about is the Time Warp column, and I'm going to examine whether skepticism is winning or losing. Before I proceed, I do want to share a personal story with you. When I was preparing this talk, my daughter walked by and she looks over at the computer and she says, "Hey, Dad, what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm preparing a talk." And she said, Dad, have you thought that I'm not sure that wallpaper is the best wallpaper for your presentation?" And I said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I was looking for a 1970s wallpaper to accompany the theme of going back to the 70s, and I couldn't find one that wasn't just possibly literally nauseating to look at." And so I reassured her, and I will reassure you that I only put it on this first slide, and then after this, I go to a nice brown 1970s color, but it's a solid color.
Well, I just want to say we're really looking forward to this. It's completely selfish that we get to have you talk about skepticism for Bay Area Skeptics. So take it away, Craig.
Thank you. Yeah, you're too kind. And I appreciate the introduction. I could just skim through this. All this has been said already. I do want to mention that one thing that I did get to do at SUNY Cortland was create a psychology of pseudoscience course. I taught it twice. And then I was lucky enough to be invited to describe the course in the fairly popular website called The Conversation. It has a section called Unusual Courses. And when I was invited to do this and I looked at the other courses, all I thought is, I want to take all these courses. They sound awesome. And that was a fun part of being at SUNY Cortland, but it was time to move back to where I grew up and live near family. And here I am at the Northshore School District. And I will always be involved with skepticism. I love it so much. And I'm just glad that I can share what I'm doing with the Time Warp column. One thing that kind of the beginning of thinking of things in terms of this idea of the time warp, which is a name I came up with for whatever reason to describe this column, is I think I was in my car. I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly. And so, yes, I was driving in my car thinking about skepticism. I don't think about skepticism all the time, but this was the moment. And I was thinking about these ongoing discussions we have with other groups. I don't like calling them debates because that's often creates some false equivalence. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could like go into the future and say, like, how long are you going to search for Bigfoot, and have that kind of answer for the points that we're trying to make. And I had an epiphany of sorts, which is that we can effectively kind of do that. And obviously we can't go to the future because that's science fiction as far as we know. I don't think that's ever going to change. But skepticism has been around long enough to look back at it from the future. And it's a way of reframing how we look at the problem. So we can take ourselves back to 1976, look at the discussion that was occurring, and then follow what happened afterwards and effectively answer what they were saying from the future. Skeptical Inquirer was perfect for this. A Skeptical Inquirer, I think we appropriately and overwhelmingly view it as a journalism tool or a communication tool, and it's an important tool in terms of trying to make the world a more rational, science-friendly, history-friendly place. But in thinking about the problem this way, it occurred to me that Skeptical Inquirer has done us an additional service by basically codifying skeptical thought over the years. Skeptical Inquirer began, I'm sure many of you know, but it began in the fall of 1976, and it began to address this frustration that so many people believe in the paranormal and other ridiculous claims. The feeling of that not changing, we'll come back to shortly. It was described as the official organ of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. It's fairly wordy, so we often think of this in terms of SciCop, and then in the organization now, of course, just CSI Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. If any of you are readers of the Time Warp, I apologize for making this joke a second time. I find it amusing that they described the journal as an organ. I think we would think of it as a heart, and I'm sure many of our haters would pick a different organ, but in any case, that's how they described it. Here's a little context for you. This is the cover of the very first Skeptical Inquirer. It was not called Skeptical Inquirer, then it was called the Zetetic. And that refers back to a philosophical tradition of skeptical inquiry. You can see there was no cover theme. Here is the fourth issue of the Skeptical Inquirer. This is the first one where Skeptical Inquirer was the headline, and you can see the Zetetic moved to the byline. And another reason to pick this one is this is the, I think right now the fifth Time Warp is coming out, and this is the fourth Time Warp, and this is the fourth issue. So this is the issue that the column that's about to come out was examining. You see here a couple of adaptations. The size of the journal is the same, the title is different, and then you have this cover art that wasn't in the first two journals. And then now here we have a modern Skeptical Inquirer. I didn't pick this one for any reason. Maybe I thought the cover looked kind of nice, but I wanted to take a moment and while we have these covers right in front of us, use it as an opportunity to think about where are the connections between skepticism here in 2023 and skepticism in 1976. And even just on the covers, you can see a couple of connections. So if you look in the upper left corner of the contemporary Skeptical Inquirer, you see the failed psychic. And you can see here at the very first issue of Skeptical Inquirer, you see the reference to Uri Geller. Uri Geller is possibly the most prominent villain in Skeptical Inquirer. It's a tremendous longevity that he's had. So you kind of see a connection there that the psychics have pervaded skeptical thought since the inception of Skeptical Inquirer. And then you have the medical misinformation. That, of course, isn't new. The flavor has changed quite a bit. But if you look at that first issue and you see the Dianetics, which is that branch of Scientology, or if you look at biorhythms, you see this theme of alternative medicine that's just not based on legitimate science. I did want to take a moment to point out one other connection, and that would be the Kendrick Frazier connection. So here you see in 2023, you see remembrances of him after he sadly passed away. And he was, he was editor of Skeptical Inquirer on the third issue, the one before this one. And when coming into skepticism and eventually thinking about this column and starting to really go through the initial issues in more detail, I think you can imagine my surprise when I opened the third Skeptical Inquirer from 1977 and I saw Ken Frazier's name as editor. And I thought, oh my, you have to be kidding me. He's been editing this journal for almost 50 years. And then I thought, wow, he looks amazing. I had no idea. And in the time that I was lucky enough to interact with Ken, he was always so supportive and gracious. And it's neat for me to see how long he really influenced skepticism with being editor and the connection that you see throughout these issues. When I think about going back in time to examine skepticism, my reasoning behind this really involves three questions. And the most obvious question is, well, what happened? That's the whole point of reframing the context in this way. Let's go back in time. Let's see what was being discussed. And then let's find out what followed with the knowledge of the future. I was also interested in trying to find areas where skepticism is blundered. And then when we find those areas, what can be learned from skepticism mistakes? My thinking on this possibly was shaped a little bit by my experience at the Air Force Academy. I was surprised, as you might expect, the Air Force Academy is really into flying and piloting. And I was surprised at how willing pilots are and how knowledgeable they are about crashes. And I think that this tradition has this really healthy approach to let's look at the worst case scenarios and learn from them. And I don't know if that shaped my thought at all. It's pretty speculative, but it seems to make sense to me that if skepticism has erred, we could do a similar hot wash, if you will, and learn from those mistakes. Now, I have this feeling that people who get frustrated with skepticism when we roll in and we say, hey, I appreciate what you're claiming here, but this is why this claim is something we would call pseudoscience, which offends people understandably. And these groups that get frustrated with the skeptics coming in and pestering them, I imagine they could be watching this talk. I'm not worried about it, but they would say, well, are you really interested in learning where skepticism has failed? Because you're probably exhibiting the same bias that you claim that we're exhibiting. And that's entirely possible. But I do think my interest in finding where skepticism is erred was really genuine. And my main argument for this can be summarized by this meme that I found on the internet. And that is failure, no matter who you are, it's going to happen to you. I guarantee it. And I thought this was a nice depiction of why we should feel okay about exploring where we really got one wrong. We don't have to bat 1,000 to be successful. And it's going to happen. And if it is, then it's an opportunity for us to live up to the principles that we espouse, that we claim that if the evidence merits changing our views, we will listen to it. And so if we find that failure, it's an opportunity to say, hey, we got that one wrong. I think it would be good for skepticism to see it. It doesn't really threaten me. So that to me was a fun part of going through these issues, is to look for the one where it's like, oh no, they were right. We kind of got over our skis on that one. So how do you go about really developing this way of looking at things? Obviously, I could do it on my own and have my own little fun intellectual exercise, but I really wanted to publish this if it were interesting. And I enjoyed contributing to Skeptical Inquirer. And given that I was going to be using the old issues of Skeptical Inquirer, it would really make little sense to try to publish it in a different area. So I found that motivating. A little bit about me, I won't go on too much about this, but I really have kind of a soft spot for bygone mindsets. Like, I just find it enjoyable to read these old Skeptical Inquirers and think about, how they were thinking about these issues when in the late 1970s. This kind of soft spot I have is part of the reason I really love reading Sherlock Holmes. And I find it so entertaining when all of a sudden at the beginning of one of the short stories, Watson's like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm doing cocaine. It's awesome. You should do it. And in case you're not a Sherlock Holmes reader, even in the late 1800s, Watson is a physician. He's like, yeah, I'm really not sure that's a good idea, Sherlock. And he's discouraging Sherlock from doing cocaine. And I think eventually Sherlock quit. But when he got bored, he did cocaine. And it's part of the reason I love movies from the 1970s. And I gave myself permission to put this one in. This is one of my favorite movies, Carrie. And Carrie came out right as Skeptical Inquirer came out. In fact, I think I referenced it in the first Time Warp column. And I find that enjoyable. Skepticism, you might not be aware of this, but this Time Warp column was actually integrated into my first version of the Psychology of Pseudoscience course. And I did this because I thought it would be good for the students. If I didn't, I obviously wouldn't do it. But I thought it would be really interesting to them to examine skepticism from so long ago. I think it was going to be less threatening. I was always worried about that kind of boomerang anxiety that you might get where people start defending different forms of pseudoscience or just untenable claims. And I also thought it was valuable because it would allow them to see how old some of the arguments are that people are making. I mean, this is exactly the point of exploring things from the future in this way, is to say, hey, this isn't new. This is really old. And maybe you'll figure out on your old, it's getting a little tired. And that's a theme we're going to see throughout this talk. This honestly allowed me to, and I looked for these opportunities, it allowed me to, I think, gain a little bit of efficiency. It allowed me to do something I was passionate about while merging it with the teaching. And so that was a real reward in terms of doing it this way. And shoot, I had another thought on this and it's just eluded me. I apologize. Oh, good. It came back to me. I thought it was important. I also pitched to them the vague possibility that maybe one day this could actually go into Skeptical Inquirer. And I was sort of operating on faith on that one. And very happily that actually happened. So I'm slowly coming through on this promise. And if you look at the Skeptical and the Time Warp columns as they come out, you'll occasionally see students included as authors. They have to be willing to follow up with the assignment and make a contribution that I think is legitimate. But most of them are kind of excited about it. And if they stay in touch and they remain enthusiastic, they have that connection to the project. Okay, so I pitched the idea to the editors of Skeptical Inquirer, to Ken and Ben, and they were both really helpful. And Ben took the lead a bit with helping me on it. And he made the suggestion. It's kind of embarrassing in retrospect. He said, well, I really think what you should do is write a version of it and see how it works. And I sat back and I thought, yeah, that's probably a pretty good idea. So I took his advice and I did that. And I did it with the first issue of Skeptical Inquirer. And I did it also knowing that this would serve as an example to the students if it actually came together. A little background on it. It to my surprise, it took me longer to settle on the format than I thought it would. I wrote it one way and I just felt like it was too sterile. And I think it was, well, let me tell you the format that I settled on. And I settled on this format, a very brief review of cultural and historical events. It's short. I enjoy it. And what happened at this time. They've moved along enough now that it's easier for me to remember them. And I go, oh my gosh, Star Wars came out. That's got to go in. It's very brief. Journal developments. I did not anticipate this being a real part of the Time Warp, but those first issues are so full of this group of people trying to sort out what they're doing. And I just couldn't resist putting that thought into the paper, and even things as silly as the title changing and Ken becoming editor. So there's a little bit on that. I expect for that to decrease over time if I'm lucky enough to keep doing this, because the difference between the 11th issue and 12th issue is probably not going to be that dramatic. But those first issues had a lot. You could really see them trying to sort out where this thing was going. And they're pleasant surprised that it survived. Well, Randy obviously saw many years of this, but I think if you went back in time and you said, I'll be giving a talk about this. I don't know why I'd make it about me, but we'll be talking about this at Bay Area Skeptics in 2023. They'd be like, wow, that's awesome. Hey, let's get back to work. And then I call this the shallow dive, kind of a peanut butter spread on the more significant articles that occurred, what they were about, just so people could see what topics came up at the time. And then a deep dive into a specific topic. And my vague memory is, the deep dive allows us to do this thing that I wanted to get into, which is, really what was being said and what followed and what can we learn from that. And I think my first draft really was just basically a issue in review. And so it was very heavy, like in terms of summarizing the feature articles. And then I think I swung the needle really over to the deep dive, and I settled on this in between that I thought worked best. The other thing that happened that I didn't expect was I was ready to just sort of let the students pick which parts of the journals that they wanted to dive into. And I realized that this was going to create a significant problem, because if you did a deep dive into one topic, you weren't going to deep dive into it again 2 issues later. And then I said, well, I need to be sort of careful in terms of about which articles you deep dive from or which issue in the journal do you deep dive into, because you're going to lose an opportunity later. So this forced me to create this kind of a map of what topics were being introduced in Skeptical Inquirer in these early issues. Now, if you're looking at this and you're thinking this is really nerdy to the point of being skeptically embarrassing, I am going, in the spirit of being authentic, to tell you this isn't even as detailed as it really is. This is sort of truncated so it could fit on a slide. But here you see the map of the different topics, and the bolded or the shaded ones are the topics that I thought would be sensible to do the deep dive in this kind of order. Excuse me. There's no ideal way to do it. I've been eager to do the Ancient Aliens deep dive. The first issue would have been a great area to do that. But I sort of tried to balance the cover theme. I wanted to stick with the cover theme as best I could, but also trying to find topics that maybe would disappear and wouldn't come back. The reason there isn't a bolded or shaded area on the 1.1 is that was the draft that Ben asked me to create, and I created for the class. And when I wrote it, I decided that it really needed to be about skepticism, not a topic within skepticism, even though that was the intent of doing the deep dives. It was just fascinating. And in fact, I'm coming back to that in literally, I think, in one slide. But after that, you can see what I sorted out. The cattle mutilations, I could not resist that one. I think it might come up in Skeptical Inquirer again once And even then, maybe not as a feature article, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity. I was fascinated by this topic. And conveniently, the strongest student that I had in the class, she was outstanding. She was like the only student interested in it, and she stuck with it. It was just a really rewarding teaching experience. And then you could see the other topics: Bermuda Triangle biorhythms, the one that's about to come out. The next one should be astrology. The two students that were involved with that are interested. Finally, ancient aliens, contemporary aliens, moons, making people give birth more is kind of a strange one there that I didn't want to miss the opportunity on. Creationism, that was inevitable. Astrology, again, because this is sort of a quirky aspect of Skeptical Inquirer. I'm going to just leave that one as a teaser, or you can ask me questions afterwards. And then pseudo-anthropology, I think that is about Castaneda, but you can see the themes coming out. And the students are lined up all the way through the creationism. After that, I should be on my own. Okay, so at this point, what I want to do is I want to go into 7 lessons I've learned from time warping, and I'm going to do them in the context of, are we winning or losing? So lesson number 1 is that skepticism has not changed much. And you heard me refer to that in terms of looking at this first issue. It's not limited to that, but what really surprised me about getting into the first issue of Skeptical Inquirer in detail was the 2 editorials at the beginning, particularly this editorial written by Marcello Truzzi. And this is just the end of it. I literally just snipped this because his name is at the end. It's about 3 pages long, maybe a little less than that in the journal. But put simply, when I read it, I thought you could reprint that today and people would hardly notice. There are a couple of little bits of it that maybe you would have to clean up, like, hey, this new kind of thing, skepticism, there might be a date in it. The one odd duck in it is he refers to the desire to have a lot of paranormal thought in the journal, not just referring to paranormal thought, but like actually having this back and forth with people who promote the paranormal in the journal. There's been very little of that. It has happened, but it's hard to find. But other than that, it sounds like the same things we say today. There's references to extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and the burden of proof being on the claimant. And this really isn't about scientific debates as much as we love science. It's really about how people believe paranormal claims and why we need to address this proliferation of nonsensical beliefs. And this was followed by Kurtz writing aims of the committee that echoed these type of thoughts. But this led me to a couple of thoughts about, well, why hasn't skepticism changed? And this is really nothing more than a thought experiment, but I really could only come up with 2 explanations. And one is that there have been these influential skeptics like Truzzi, like Kurtz, so many others, Randy, that said, this is what we need to do. And they shaped skepticism over time, that there's been sort of a status quo about our organization, and people have kind of kept that status quo over the years. You can look in the journal and you can see important follow-ups that reiterate these themes. Ken Fraser did this numerous times, and then Carl Sagan had one that was really, this is what skepticism is and why it matters. And so one argument is that the skeptic greats, or the people that took the time to try to influence skepticism, kind of kept this boat going the same direction. But I think another viewpoint is that that skepticism has a particular place that it serves in our civilization, and that's why skepticism doesn't change. I apologize if there are any sociologists out there and I don't get this quite right and I make it a little cringy, but my understanding is this is sort of the broad structural functional perspective in sociology, that organizations develop or things develop because they serve a purpose, and that's what they do in society. Why would that be the case for skepticism? Well, once somebody took the time, this group of people, PsyCop, and said, this is formally what we're going to do. This is the problem, and we are going to solve it. That problem has not been solved. And the way that we engage in this hasn't changed because the social problem hasn't changed. That social problem is people believe a lot of nonsense. They believe nonsense for consistent reasons. So the things that we say in response to that nonsense hasn't really changed very much. Just because it's been so consistent over time and because so clearly we can see the nature of this debate, I lean towards the structural functional perspective. I think that the initial founders of PsyCop, they saw the problem, they identified the problem correctly, they created this organization, and here we are still doing the same thing. Are we winning or losing? I'm going to give this one a push because on the one hand, our consistency in how we engage, I think, speaks well for skepticism. But obviously, the counter argument to that is we haven't said, "Hey, look, we're done. We did it. Nobody believes nonsense anymore." In fact, there's plenty of it. We'll come back to that. And so I think we certainly can't call it a victory. I mean, I just think we all know that. And I'm sorry if I'm too cynical. But on the other hand, I'm going to give us some credit. So I'm going to call this one a push. Okay, are we winning or losing? Lesson number 2. Lesson number 2, I think, is a powerful lesson, and I hope you find it interesting. I do. And that is that skepticism, and from one perspective, is rarely wrong. And I'm going to keep this simple, stupid. I'm going to throw this out at you. You could argue, based on Skeptical Inquirer in the late 70s, so we'll go late 70s, 1976, 1980, you could argue skepticism from one perspective is undefeated. And I'm going to bring up the slide again. And I'm just going to ask you to look at it and try to find the area where skeptics express some criticism. And in the 45 years that have transpired since, nearly 50 years, that you go, wow, we really shouldn't have engaged in that way. So these topics are topics, as you might imagine, in the tradition of skepticism that skeptics are critical of. And where are the aliens? Where are the ancient aliens? Astrology doesn't work. Biorhythms. And I haven't found it. It might be there, but I have not found the one that you could look at and you could say, hey, we really should have listened to the paranormal. It's not paranormal anymore. It's normal. I don't see it. I haven't met any fairies. And the Einstein there, interestingly, those 2 letters I think are fascinating. I thought it was a really neat addition to these early issues. Somebody uncovered a couple letters that Einstein wrote. I apologize to the author. I can't remember who did it. And and Einstein was like, yeah, really, he basically was politely not down with this psychic kind of thing. But from this perspective, we're undefeated. This is a criticism of skepticism. We get accused of going after low-hanging fruit. I don't agree with that criticism. I think that we have a process for, we don't address these things because they're obvious. We address them because people believe in them. So you can call them low-hanging fruit, but that's the problem we're trying to address. How are we undefeated? Well, I think it comes down to 2 things. One is skepticism is obviously associated with critical thinking. And it would be pretty embarrassing if we promoted critical thinking and we weren't any better at identifying more reliable claims than people who didn't promote this type of critical thinking. So the critical thinking presumably serves to our advantage. But there's another part of skepticism that I think it's underappreciated, and that is that skepticism is really a community where we can vet our beliefs in terms of what we address as a community. In fact, I am confident that individual skeptics believe a fair amount of nonsense, surely not as much as others believe, but there's probably a skeptic out there that thinks, and I really love skepticism, but we're wrong on that Bermuda Triangle thing, or we're wrong on that ancient alien thing. But as a group, we have a process for kind of weeding out things that aren't at that level that we're going to sort of take on informally as a community. I don't think there's any group that says it's going to be this 10, but in the publications, in the discussions, in the presentations, you see sort of these things that become important enough, like climate change denial, or creationism, for skeptics to kind of make them at the center of what we do. And together, I think that leads to this incredible winning streak from this perspective. So I'm going to give us a winning on this one. By the way, if you type in winning into Google Images, you very quickly get an image of Simone Biles. I thought really the word winning isn't any better of an indication of winning than Simone Biles. And so I'm just using Simone Biles as the designation of winning among skeptics. So thank you, Simone, for winning this one. But then we go on to lesson number 3. Even though that we might be correct in our thinking, or we have not been proven to be incorrect, and one could even possibly argue that we were undefeated in the 4 years that I'm referring to. At the same time, it seems also equally clear that paranormal beliefs are really hard to extinguish. And this leads to what I believe is an important question, particularly because skeptics can get discouraged, either broadly or within certain areas. What's the standard? Whoops, I got ahead of myself there. What's the standard that we are really expecting out of skepticism? Are we expecting that we express why certain beliefs are not tenable, and that we need to convince so many people that the beliefs effectively become negligible in society? Or are we succeeding if we're just moving the needle such that there would be more belief in either a particular claim or claims more broadly if we didn't exist doing the work that we do? And I think success can be defined as moving the needle. If we are keeping fewer people from believing things that could kill them or harm them or just make society a little more ridiculous, I think we're succeeding. But this creates a bit of a problem, which is then how do you measure that? How do you know? You can't really. And so then you kind of sound non-falsifiable in the same way that you criticize other people for being non-falsifiable. So that concerns me. And then the other thing that concerns me is I'm going to go into this with only one form of pseudoscience, and that's going to be astrology. If there's any form of pseudoscience that you think we could kill, it would be astrology. It's just so bad for two big reasons. The first is the explanatory mechanism is just so ridiculous. Like where Mars was when I was born affects my personality. Like how? Like I don't need to, you get it. The other thing is astrology is testable. So you would think if we could get on top of any of these, this would be it. Yet it thrives. And this book I picked intentionally because this isn't even the traditional, hey, if you're born in this month, your personality is probably like this. This is this is something that seems to have grown in recent years. And that is the notion that you should pick your partner based on your zodiac sign compatibility. I was trained in graduate school, even though I'm a social psychologist, I was trained in the tradition of romantic relationships. And I look at this and I just shake my head. It's hard enough to have a successful long-term marriage. And if you want to use science to do it, pick somebody who has good mental health, who treats you with respect and can hold down a job, right? And here you're encouraging people to say, this person drinks all the time and hit on my girlfriend, but our zodiac signs match up. So maybe it's going to be okay. It's so ridiculous, yet it won't end. And when you look at this, I'm afraid I'm just going to have to give us a losing on this one. We just should be able to do better than this in terms of making these beliefs deteriorate to a stronger degree. Why do we lose? I'm going to lean into the time travel aspect of this. There's a lot of discussion in skepticism about why do people believe ridiculous claims. That discussion obviously is completely appropriate. It needs to continue, and it is something that I celebrate and I take part in. But what I did with the time warp column, such that it is, was to examine this from a certain perspective, and I'm going to lean into that perspective. I hope it doesn't get annoying. I'm a little worried that I might sound a bit like one of those servers at like a Western themed restaurant that just gets a little too into the Western theme. But in any case, that's what we're talking about today. And I like the time travel part of this. So What do I see in terms of looking back at this in 1970? And to my surprise, for me, two big lessons stand out to me, which is different than I would come up with if I were just thinking of this in terms of, this ongoing static argument that we have at any given time with people and not looking back at how old these discussions are. Pardon me. Okay, the first big reason is as simple as people hear folklore and they never get to the bottom of that folklore. So they turn on the History Channel. They see all sorts of shows about the Bermuda Triangle. They might be desperate to stream movies for free, and they watch Monster Island and Carmen Electra. It's awful. And they go, man, there's just something to that Bermuda Triangle thing. And unlike skeptics, they don't ever just read Kush's book and go, wow, this is not real. Same thing with Bigfoot. Here you have a children's book, so you can get people started on Bigfoot ease early. I went into this one. I'm not a believer in Bigfoot. I haven't been for a long time. But I did have a friend of mine that was a biology professor, and this was a little uncomfortable because, you have to do this disclaimer, like, I don't believe in Bigfoot, but if I were to, what would you tell me? And he just crushed it. It was so easy, and it's not anything different than skeptics say, but he's a biology professor, and we were at a soccer game. Our kids were playing soccer. And he says, hey, Craig, you see that field out there? I said, yeah. And he goes, I can go out in that field, and I can find hair, poop, and bones for every mammal that lives in this area. And he's like, you're never going to find it for Bigfoot. And he's like, that's it. And then he stops and he says, and there's no fossil record. And I said, okay, well, I was convinced already, but thank you. And, you hear the chatter about Bigfoot, you just don't get to the bottom of it that way. Cattle mutilations, this is a little gratuitous on my part. I picked this one because this Tucker Carlson's originals is not at all originals. These are old arguments in terms of what happens with cattle mutilations is that, cattle mutilations by themselves aren't pseudoscience. They're just dead cows that look mutilated. What happens is people don't understand, like they're surprised by it, and then they invite in other explanations. So I call this a paranormal inviting occurrence. And what gets invited in is aliens or government conspiracies or satanic groups, or this one actually has a grain of truth to it, of actual beef stealing, but it certainly doesn't explain all the cattle mutilations that are reported. Not original at all. Skeptical Inquirer covered this in the second issue. By the way, it was a movie in the 1980s with Robert Ulrich. This took the government conspiracy angle that had a cattle mutilation theme. And Sybil Shepherd and Raymond Burr were in a cattle mutilation themed movie, or at least a movie that prominently featured cattle mutilations, and it had an alien theme. So not at all original Tucker Carlson. In fact, I was ready to call this a deceased pseudoscience, but Tucker Carlson thwarted me. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like on Fox. But anyway, this is, of course, why Skeptical Inquirer and skeptics fondly say, I doubt it. People just believe too quickly. The underlying principle here psychologically is reservation of judgment. They go, oh my gosh, it's on the History Channel. There must be some truth to it. And no, experts would tell you there isn't. There's no Bermuda Triangle mystery. Ships disappear all over the place, and some of these stories aren't actually true. Anyway, that's what I saw in the time warp. So on this one, I'll say we're losing. I'm laying it on a little thick because this is just a Y to lesson 3, but got one more of these. Lesson 5, the other reason we lose that you really see from a time warp perspective. And that is the structure of claims and the burden of proof. And you could think about this, the potential for evidence versus evidence. Claims exist such that they can be demonstrated, but it can be impossible to disprove them. That's why it makes sense to ask for evidence for something, not to discredit a hypothetical. And when you go through this time warp process, I feel like it really, that issue stands out more greatly than you see it in a static discussion. Because and it's hard for me to say this because that people will misuse this, but what you have is you have this opportunity for people, when you discredit one model, to just move on to another model. And it doesn't make any sense. You say, look, show me that you have some evidence for something. This occurs in a couple of different ways. So one is these sort of paranormal inviting occurrences where people have they say this thing is happening and it's because of this specific reason potentially. And in the case of the Bermuda Triangle, you have this is surely a picture of an interdimensional portal, which is one of the explanations. The others are weather. There's one that I really enjoy, which is the idea that underneath the Bermuda Triangle is an ancient civilization that had such advanced technology. They had a beam that could disintegrate things. And so the civilization is gone, but the beam is still on and it vaporizes things. Well, by time warping, you say, look, this discussion's really old. You've had 40 years to show me the portal and the weather, and you've got nothing. Same with cattle mutilations, right? Where are the satanic killers and the government? The government conspiracy has been doing this for 40 years and we've never found out about it. By the way, the article in the Skeptical Inquirer was about an issue like a couple years before Skeptical Inquirer came out. So this is like 50 years old, older than that, really. Dowsing. Dowsers can demonstrate that dowsing works. But when you discredit dowsing, it's like, well, that dowser didn't work. So people need to better understand how evidence works because they live in this perpetual world of, well, maybe it works. Same with astrology. Astrology is testable, but you debunk one form of astrology and then they go, well, this still works if you take time of birth into consideration, or if maybe Emily's model doesn't work, but Mark's model would work. And so instead, you reach a point where on all of these, where the logical thing to say, and it's something skeptics are comfortable with, but it's nobody should believe any of this until somebody can bring forth some evidence of reliability, because it's just the same nonsense chatter over and over and over again. This is one of the reasons we're losing. There is possibly an area where we are winning, and this is the case I made for biorhythms. Biorhythms, I would argue, is a victory for skepticism. My basis for this is that when I was going through these old Skeptical Inquirers, I have to confess, I saw biorhythms and I thought, what in the world are biorhythms? I've never heard of this. And I'm surprised that I hadn't heard of it because it was more popular than I expected and it lasted longer than I expected it to. So for those of you that don't know, because it's largely defunct, biorhythms is this notion that from the time you are born, you have these performance cycles that are on a daily calendar forever. And what that means is if you know somebody's birth date, you can predict using biorhythm theory of how they're going to perform at any particular time. And so here is a biorhythm chart. This biorhythm chart, there are still biorhythm online calculators. This one uses my birthday. So I was born on August 20th, 1971. And then the target date that I calculated was today. And so I could look at it and I could ask myself, do my biorhythm suggest I'm going to give a particularly good talk? And I was hoping I'd bottom out because I thought it would be more humorous. But you can see here that my intellectual is slightly above average. So maybe this was a better day for me to do this. But my emotional is still a little high. So maybe I'll start to get, really weepy about this or something. Evidence that biorhythms was really pretty popular. The Soviets created little biorhythm calculators, I think, for their Olympic athletes. I don't know why you would do this, because one of the problems with biorhythms as a surviving pseudoscience is it didn't emphasize solutions very well. So I don't know how you go to like an archer and say like, oh man, you're performing on a bad physical day. Well, glad you know. So I don't know why that would be helpful, but they were into it. You could buy in the 1980s, I think, early 80s, it looks early 80s, you could buy a kit from Casio with a biorhythm calculator. I got one of these. Whoops, I got one of these for myself. This is a Radio Shack biorhythm calculator. And then they also have digital ones. I have one of those back there too. But here's a whole little box with a couple of, with Michael J. Fox and Nicole Kidman knockoff to market it. And then the biorhythms, I just find this humorous. People have heard me bring this up. read the column, and Julia has heard me bring this up, the managing editor, Skeptical Inquirer. Biorhythms was big enough that it was a cartridge in the Mattel home computer system. So imagine an Atari 2600 with a little bit more capability that you plugged cartridges into. Well, you could buy your Biorhythms cartridge and plug that in. A brief side note, I look at this and I see something I want to draw your attention to, and that is just, it's so embarrassing how many men are apparently persuaded by this argument. But you see just a little sort of benign thread towards the typical health promotion, bogus health promotion, well-being promotion product. They always have to get that love life kind of angle in there. You see it with Nugenics. They always have to insert that, hey, you're going to be ripped and you're going to feel better. And oh, by the way, the she'll like it too kind of avenue, like, you know, that somehow this person's just been waiting for you to perform better, both romantically and physically. And it just cracks me up that they had to get on these things. As much as it's about intellectual and physical, you know, they had to get the couples in on these along with the tennis player. Biorhythms probably died because of three things. One is it just doesn't provide as much hope as like, hey, use this ointment and you're going to feel better and your performance is just universally going to be better. It's really about what days are you going to be good on. It's an average neutral, so it's not that exciting. The arguments in favor of it are really ridiculous. Like, why would you have biorhythms that are consistent for everybody perfectly on 23, 28, and 33-day cycles? That's physical, emotional, and intellectual, respectively. And the other problem with biorhythms is it's really testable. It's not results elusive. Biorhythms really got locked into those days. There were several investigations of it. Several of them were published in Skeptical Inquirer. No evidence for biorhythms. And I'd like to think that skepticism helped kill this pseudoscience. So I'm going to give us Simone Biles for winning on that one. Lastly, that takes me to lesson number 7. Lesson number 7 would be kind of a summative analysis. And that summative analysis would be, is there more nonsense now than there was in the late 1970s? This is really hard to say. Going back to the 1970s, I can put this in a few categories. One would be continuing nonsense. So you think of Ancient Aliens. Wow, that one is brutal. It was in the first issue, and it seems to be on a constant stream on cable or dish. So not going away. Psychics not going away. Decreased nonsense. Well, we got biorhythms. Maybe that moon-related birth thing isn't popular anymore. And then you have new nonsense. Flat Earth, arguably, has become more popular in recent years. Facilitated communication, I would argue, wasn't a pseudoscience in 1980. It was on its way to becoming a pseudoscience. I think at that point it hadn't been discredited enough to be called a pseudoscience, but it is now. And you put these things together and it's rough. There's a lot for skeptics to do. At the same time, maybe we're containing a lot of nonsense, so I'm not going to call us losers on this one. I'm going to give this a push. Taken together, what would I say going through this process? What can we do to be more effective? I would argue that we really have to focus more on education. There's evidence that education works. One nice example of this would be the solid evidence, great evidence from a college course that specifically devoted to taking on paranormal beliefs in college students, showing in pre-post designs with a control that students believed less in these ridiculous claims. I did a pre-post using the same measure in my own 2 classes, and even with a much, much smaller sample size, I found evidence that students believed less in ridiculous claims at the end of the course. How do people get there? Well, we can focus on a small set of cognitive skills. And based on my experience, I would say let's keep it simple and let's just start with 4. Teaching people to reserve judgment, not to be so quick to believe things, understanding the burden of proof and how that relates to evidence and why, without evidence in support of a claim, we should be skeptical of it. Addressing people's penchant for just handpicking anecdotes when they want to believe something. It's such an obvious unfair way or inappropriate way to try to justify a claim. And when you when you're trained in seeing it, and then conspiracy theories as a mechanism for trying to justify the absence of scientific evidence. And I think we really need to push for educational change that promotes critical thinking for the contemporary world. I feel fortunate every day that I miss being a professor. I miss being part of that environment and being involved in that discussion. I miss my psychology of pseudoscience class, but I feel very fortunate that I'm hopefully going to get my chance to try to insert critical thinking, here at the school district and share that with other people that are making similar efforts. That is everything I have. I go on to my slide that is obviously the end, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Craig. That was really interesting. I was laughing pretty hard through a lot of that. I do have to admit that while you were talking, I was on eBay shopping for biorhythm calculators. And it turns out you can get them under $20. And I feel like that's a bargain now because I had forgotten about biorhythms until you talked about that. So your first lesson, skepticism has not changed much because people have not changed much because science have not changed much. That's true. But there's something that's happened in the last decade that I think has really had a pretty big impact on society that's aligned with social media. And that's this rise of fake news and mistrust of the media. And that's happened on our watch. As skeptics, we kind of knew that this was coming. We knew that it was a possibility, and it happened on our watch. So big impact on society. And we didn't really build the structure to ensure that we'd minimize the impact. We couldn't stop it. And now it's kind of the underlying structure supporting lots of other more specific pseudoscience. So as skeptics, have we succeeded on the little things and missed the big picture?
I think on this one, we did miss the big picture. But I also think we can forgive ourselves for that. I think an interesting thought experiment, being like many of us old enough to remember the advent of the internet, is I think if we went back at that time and asked, is this going to increase nonsense or decrease nonsense? I think it would have been a spirited debate. With the benefit of hindsight, in my opinion, it's increased nonsense. I think the evidence backs that up.
Yeah.
And it looks pretty obvious because it seems to me that what we missed was the power of the brick and mortar institution helped keep a lot of this ridiculousness at bay. And to illustrate this, like in class, I could tell students that I said, imagine trying to get a flat earth movement going in 1980. Right? You would have, like, we know what it would have looked like. You would have had an advertisement in some weird magazine, not weird bad, but it would have been like the Ocho on ESPN. It would have been some quirky magazine. You would have had to have a newsletter. You'd be collecting checks for like $2.20 and trying to get people going. The flat earth is such a great place to example this. I'm just going to say, like, a lot of flat earthers are smart. Like they're traditionally smart. They produce videos that look good. They're tech smart. They're wrong on flat earth. I would disagree with them politely on that. And we just missed that. We just missed seeing that narrative getting shared in that way. That's what I think really has just happened is we don't have, the battleground is more equal between experts and your neighbor who believes in flat earth now. I think we can forgive ourselves for not anticipating that, but with the hindsight bias, it looks bad.
Yeah, it feels like we could have put some kind of structure in place. Like, I remember we did a few skeptical things, like we were promoting Web of Trust for a while. We were promoting, a number of different technical solutions to this as well. And it just seems like we missed out. But
Well, one thing I find really interesting is when I applied for this job, and I'm hoping that other school districts aren't alone in this. Um, they did something that was really smart. They actually made me do a performance task. And the performance task was so aligned with my actual job that
Hmm.
at some point about 3 months ago, I started to work on a task and I went back to my interview, pulled up the information that I did for the interview because I knew it was in there. And that task was to examine one of our district strategic goals and to report back on it. And one of our strategic goals is critical thinking. And as you might imagine, I picked that strategic goal. And buried in that strategic goal is basically information literacy with an online focus. So my coworkers get it, right? They got it before I got here. And I bet the audience will understand this, but I showed up hoping that there wouldn't have been a lot of progress on this, right? Like I was like, I don't want to have to undo anything. You know, I want to be on the ground level on this. And we're still trying to get that off the ground.
Right.
But you can imagine the problems that will come with instituting critical thinking. And it's just typical of what we face, where everybody loves critical thinking until you take on a claim that they believe. And then they're like, that's not critical thinking. What critical thinking is for most people is it's that people reach smart beliefs, and smart beliefs is identified by what I believe, right? People don't walk around and go, I believe all these things that are foolish. And so they really only identify critical thinking when it's not what they do. But I'm hopeful that if you kind of just keep the focus on a process, that we can get there. So there are avenues to try to teach children this. In the abstract, everybody understands. Like I can go to anybody and I could say, do you want your children to not learn or to learn how to avoid misinformation on the internet? They're all going to say yes. And then you go, oh, you mean like this argument about I'm trying to not pick one that could be controversial. Flat Earth.
Sure.
And, the flat earther out there is going to go, well, not that one. That's the legitimate site.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's nothing new, but we need to go there now. Like, kids need to learn this, and they need to learn it early.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think your answer really is education, but that's a lot. That takes a long time to push through society.
Oh, it's going to be, I go into it humbly. I actually found an article called Why Critical Thinking Efforts in Public Education Fail. And I thought it was a wonderful article, just very realistic about the barriers that exist. But it isn't the main part of my job because I have a lot of other responsibilities. Right. But as long as I'm in this position, I'm going to try. And I feel very fortunate that I stumbled into a school that had identified this strategic goal so clearly. And in case any of the community members out there in the Northshore School District are watching, right, this is, in my opinion, a really important and valuable skill that we want our Northshore students to learn. Their failures in critical thinking can kill people, right? Like they do kill people. There's no disputing it. There's a certain number of people get harmed and die from being duped into bogus medical practices. So we're trying to save kids' lives.
Absolutely. Maybe the most important thing that we can do. And you talked about astrology as being the easiest pseudoscience to beat, but it's Barnum's statements, and Barnum's statements are, as you said, testable, but they always pass, right?
Yeah.
I think flat Earth is easier. I think homeopathy is my go-to, is the easiest one to beat. If you believe in homeopathy, I think I can convince you of anything, right?
Yeah.
And yet I know people trained in chemistry who still believe in homeopathy, which blows my mind.
Oh, I hate to admit this, but I was at Walgreens years ago and I was trying to buy medicine and I texted a picture to my lovely wife and I'm like, what is this? And she's like, it's homeopathy. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm getting fooled. This is so wrong. Like,
yeah.
If anybody would know, because the ingredients like, K212. And I was like, what is this? She's like, it's made up stuff. So
absolutely.
It's brutal. Yeah.
Crazy. Do we have any questions from the YouTube audience? Here's our first one, and that is from Brent Sisa, a cello player extraordinaire. I know him well. Can you discuss the prehistory of skepticism before the publication of Skeptical Inquirer? Are there many parallels with the ancient Greek school of thought?
Oh, this question is too smart. I am going to distract a little bit by saying my son is a cello player, so I love the cello. I do not feel qualified to discuss the prehistory of skepticism. I will give hopefully a semi-informed answer that honestly might not even be smart enough for anybody in the audience to be moved by it at all. But I would say that I would say that scientific skepticism as we live it is certainly different than skepticism has been as used by philosophers. And that's why you see that scientific skepticism designation. You could go, the skepticism was often about more along the lines of how do we trust knowledge in anything? It didn't have this focus in terms of a sea of claims where the way we interpret it today is where we take on claims that are unreliable yet oddly popular. So in that respect, I guess I'm giving an answer. If you mean by prehistory of skepticism, what happened in 1960 skepticism, I wouldn't be able to answer that very well. I'm worried that's an unsatisfied answer, but I'm sticking with it.
Fair enough. Do we have another question? From Scott Bastian, do more or less people believe in astrology today compared to 50 years ago? Astrology is a fun one because this is one where I think if we all got together and petitioned all the newspapers to remove this stuff, a lot fewer people would see it, and then a lot fewer people would believe in it. What do you think?
Well, the proper way to answer this would be to look at polls or to look at the scientific literature. I think I would bet there's enough out there that you could cobble together an answer. Glenn Branch and I, particularly because he's smarter than I am and better at following these things than I am, and I ride in his wake, we follow the polls on flat Earth. And that's why I can say in that area, I think the evidence is really that it's grown. In terms of astrology, I don't have that level of expertise. I would say that based on my experience in the classroom, based on the survey I gave in the classroom, based on the limited, vague awareness I have of other research, based on my interactions with students, that's getting pretty unscientific. I would say, I'm going to say, I don't know. I did all that lead up. I don't know. It's certainly still popular, but at the same time, I was getting ready to say yes, but then it was featured so prominently in newspapers for years. I really don't know. I made a note about this. I would like to, I'm just going to make I'm going to point out my own really beautiful segue here to get out of this question. I would like to have the time to examine this. And what's even better is that Scott is a Seattle skeptic like me. So thank you, Scott, for being here and representing. And if we could come up with an answer, this would be a great topic for our group at Pizza, and everybody's invited.
Can I just say that my favorite answer is, I don't know, but let's go find out.
It is a good answer. Of course, you can't use it all the time.
Yeah.
But I would tell my students, I don't know if you don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. I also actually had a class activity that I did at the Air Force Academy, and it was just asking students to say, I was wrong. I'd say, just say I was wrong. And they'd look around, it's fine. They go, I was wrong. I'm like, the world didn't fall, did it? Right? It's okay. Nobody came after you.
We'll survive. Do we have another question?
We need to get one I actually can answer.
Linda Rosa, former nurse and mother of a skeptic, asks, some, like Richard Dawkins, claim many skeptics have lost their way by embracing identity politics. believing there are more than two sexes, the biological equivalent of intelligent design. Comment? Well, this is a minefield. This is a very live conversation in the skeptical community right now.
Yeah, it is indeed, and a conversation that I would have to be careful with myself because I really like my job. But let's see. I don't know what you mean by identity politics. Feel free to follow up. I will give Linda a moment. I was also in a skeptics group with Linda because Linda's in Colorado, and that's how I know her. And I miss our group there as well. And I'm just lucky that Scott has another group for me. Syracuse Skeptics I never got into. So you have a third one. If it's from Syracuse, I'm going to feel like you were tracking me. On this one, have we lost our way by identifying by identity politics? I would say that where I am concerned, I'm really glad to get this question. I would say the biggest issue on this is for skeptics to not lose their way through tribalism. That's the concern. Is it's easy to believe things because other skeptics believe it. And like I said, when you look at our track record, if somebody said, here's a claim, skepticism says the claim is false, I think our track record says your money is on the skeptic community being right. But that isn't the process. We're supposed to believe things because of the evidence. If we just believe them because our group says them, we might get the right outcome, but we're losing our way in terms of how we process information. When political discussions get really emotional, we are more apt to have that mistake occur. My response to this question will be a typical psychological response, and that is whether you're talking about the biology of sex or whether you are talking about gender roles and how people identify in terms of sex. And psychologists are typically pretty comfortable with seeing those things as different. So I'm not going to let myself off the hook too much. I don't know if this question is asking me to say.
I will tell you that some of this question comes from Richard Dawkins' discussion at the recent SciCon conference. This was
unfortunately, I missed that conference. Did he get everybody fired up?
You could say that, yes.
Yeah, I missed it, and it would be wrong to speak to it, and I want to leave time for other questions.
Fair enough. I think also, we had an issue on social justice in our movement about probably 7 or 8 years ago, where some people said, what's with all these Bigfoot skeptics? What's with all these people that believe in all the not important stuff? It should all be about social justice. And I think we've got a big tent in skepticism. We have to tackle a lot of stuff. And there are people that are passionate about lots of different items, lots of different specific subjects, and are experts in lots of specific subjects. And I think it's great that we can have discussions about all of these different things and cast a skeptical eye on all these different things.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what you see is I agree. We
were almost ripped apart as a movement 7 or 8 years ago by the social justice argument. And I think what we do is too important to get us ripped apart by any one subject.
I agree. Yeah, if people are being true to the evidence, then they need to speak their mind. But it's also fair to understand that people who are in Richard Dawkins' position that don't really need employment anymore, They don't have to worry about some things other people have to worry about. But regarding the part on skepticism, yeah, we very much have to guard against being a political movement. And I mean, I wrote an article about that. We have to guard against. Skepticism can be a movement that disagrees with political claims because they're not rooted in evidence appropriately. But skepticism is not a liberal movement. That's a political action group. And so in that respect, within the skeptical community, we do need to give people space to say things that are uncomfortable.
100%. 100% agree. Very good. Do we have another question?
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you. 100%. Critical thinking in grade school. I've had a couple of very, very wise people that are more versed in developmental psychology than I am caution me about the idea of critical thinking in grade school. But I do think there are some very basic principles that could be introduced into grade school that would help students develop some skills that would lead into more sophisticated critical thinking thought later. To me, this is the brass ring. In fact, thank you so much for bringing this up. I failed in this part of the talk. Humans, one thing that drives me nuts is this is the way humans are. The problem with the way people process information is we're just good enough to think that we're so smart, and we are, like, we built airplanes and we built all sorts of things that are really amazing that are actually true. Decoding GNA is amazing, but we have obvious failures in terms of how we process information, and they make humans vulnerable. We have to admit this. I'm fond of saying this. This is the way humans are, right? This is why I push the situationist view on, and I also believe in it, on skepticism, right? These aren't dumb people. That's what people do. Part of my use of the word dumb, I shouldn't do that. These are not foolish, stupid people, right? These are often smart, sane people that are human. And the only way to get the brass ring on this is to admit that and start training people to not make these mistakes at a younger age. Mm-hmm. Until we do that, I think we're just always going to be going round and round, playing whack-a-mole on these things. This is the way humans are. This is what they do. I've done it. It's hard to admit because you only see it when you get out of it. And some of you have heard me share, I'm chugging chocolate milk. It's just stupid. It doesn't make you rip. You would know, right? I need the perfect protein balance in my window after lifting. It's like, okay, maybe the protein part's sort of accurate, but it doesn't need to be chocolate milk.
That's too funny. And, also to an earlier point we talked about, it's okay for intelligent people to look at the same evidence and disagree.
Yes. Skepticism, right? There's always going to be some conjecture. Skepticism really addressed the wildly, the wildly inappropriate interpretations. Yeah. Within that's what skepticism and critical thinking really gives us. That's what being evidence-based really gives us, is it gives us an avenue to talk politely, right? To say, well, tell me why you believe that, and to try to sort it out in a manner that's more effective than you're just stupid. And that's what's really valuable about the process. And that's where we really stay true to those principles. It's not always easy to do because we're human, but that's what it really is. Skepticism is a way of interpreting evidence, clearly aligned with critical thinking.
And the best skeptical conversations I've ever had, I come out of them learning something. I might disagree with someone. I might end up either leaving with my same interpretation or getting a new interpretation, but learning something in the process. So yes, I kind of want to wrap things up asking you about my favorite ever Sunday morning paper that I wrote. So for those of you that don't know, at the major skeptical conferences on the Sunday morning at the end of the conference, we let people get up on stage and do it's selected, screened 15-minute presentation on a paper that they've written on a subject that they've done their homework on. And Craig, you wrote one of my favorite Sunday morning papers and one of my favorite talks on Sunday morning. And I loved it because it was something that it's my favorite category of these papers, which is something that I could have done. And if I wanted, I could check it. I could do it again and check it. Can you talk about the paper I'm talking about?
I can. I just want to confirm you're talking about the God in Sports paper.
I am.
Okay. This was another epiphany. I don't have very many of these. I think they're the only two good ones I've had. But it occurred to me, people will sometimes, a lot of people believe that God is influencing sports. And I realized that there was a way to provide I think what would be a legitimate test of this. And that would be to examine whether religious schools were more likely to defeat non-religiously affiliated schools in the first round of the NCAA tournament. And I constrained basketball, and I constrained it to that for a reason, because the claim would be, like, I don't think anybody claims that God's influencing every sport, right? Otherwise, the Southern Methodist would be like, 6,000-0 unless they played another religious school. But if you think about the first round of the tournament, what you have is this very clear structure in terms of seeding made by a committee that presumably is making secular decisions, right? They're looking at records, and I can't imagine anybody in the committee is raising their hand and they're saying, hey, that's a Catholic school. We got to give them a higher seed. So the seeding is almost surely entirely secular as best as it could be. But then that first round of the tournament is hugely, hugely important to teams. So my thinking was, if God were to ever intervene on these games, you would possibly be able to detect the effect by showing that religiously affiliated schools were beating secular schools at a slightly elevated rate when compared to their control group of a religious matchup or a secular matchup. Now, of course, there's a million variants people could suggest. They could say, well, God really liked Catholics or this or that. But a student and I, he was great. He loved sports. We had so much fun with this. We sifted through all the evidence. We coded all the schools. We took 5 years of the NCAA tournament, and we compared the ratios of victories. And it's all error, right? There's nothing going on. And I really wanted to publish this paper, and I've never gotten to it. And it's been 5 years, so we could do the replication and make it an even better paper. We'll have a football tournament where this can happen with a smaller sample size, but 32 games every year. And there isn't any evidence. One thing that I did, though, that I was careful about was, it's not really a paper about whether God exists. We can have that discussion, but whether God exists and whether God is influencing sports are two different questions. And to me, it really provided a safer context for sifting through these kind of thoughts. I didn't feel any need to go after the existence of God. I don't.
And a clear, testable claim.
Yeah, but
testable claim, and you tested it.
And we did well. There's all sorts of workarounds. People could say, sure, God saves it for the final. I
sure.
don't know. But we did test it, and we did not find any evidence for Jesus taking the wheel in the NCAA basketball game. So
well, and I remember going up to you after you did the talk, and my fear was that this was going to be some staunch atheist talk, and it wasn't. It was a testable claim tested by a skeptic with good skepticism, and I remember part of the outcome was the secular schools did slightly better. Just slightly. And I remember walking up to you after and saying, if in fact prayer has no effect, it could have gone the other way. What would you have done then?
What do you mean the other way? If prayer had no effect, secular schools would do better?
Well, no. So your findings had that secular schools did slightly better than religious schools.
Yep.
Like, it was very minor.
It's probably error, yeah.
Probably error. But it could have gone the other way. Religious schools could have got a little better, right?
Yes.
And the answer you gave me was yeah, well, then I would have presented that. Right.
I would have. Well, it's going to happen. This is you teach us in statistics. I did a oh my God. If anybody's still watching, I hope you're entertained. In my class, I would do a lucky number study every semester, and I would divide people into teams, and I'd make a 7, and I'd make a 13, and I'd make a control group. I never had the guts to do a 666 because I thought I could get in a little trouble, a little too edgy, right? And I promised, and this was genuine. I said, look, if your team wins in this random number draw and your mean is statistically higher, I will buy you donuts. I promise I will buy you donuts. And in theory, the lucky number 7 team should win, right? They never did. It was always a wash. But according to statistical probability, if you tested this 20 times, they're going to win once just by accident. And I would have bought the donuts.
Yeah.
It's because it's still a statistical lesson, but that's really the lesson. And the science lesson on this, and science needs to do a better job on this. Not that they're going to listen to me, but you really, I don't know why you would believe any scientific paper anymore until it's replicated by somebody other than the scientists. And I hate to be that cynical, but that's just what good science is somebody publishes it. And if that effect is reliable, other people need to find it. There's too much of it's out in one article and then it's in a textbook and it's hard to undo that learning and it's in the paper. But if it came out, I would have said, go figure, right? And look at it this way. This is the same with Bigfoot. This is the other way of viewing it. Imagine if I was the person that detected God's influence. It's like,
yep.
Yeah, well, that'd be pretty spectacular. But
and that's what good skepticism is all about.
Yeah.
No, I thought it was just like, the one thing I tell skeptics who are wondering what to do in the skeptical movement is I say, do something. Just like go out there and test a claim. And this was exactly that. And it was just brilliant. So
it was really funny. And I'm going to add just really quickly. I've had the good fortune of having a couple people share. There's some really funny stories in this genre. And Linda Rosa, who asked the question, sent me one. The soccer team that hired a witch doctor to curse the other soccer team.
Sure.
Famous moments. The Tebow was.
Yep.
So anyway,
crazy. Well, Craig, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. We do these SkepTalks and they're a little bit selfish because we get to talk to great people. And tonight is particularly selfish for me because I've loved your work and I love your column. And you did my favorite Sunday morning paper of all time. And this was a really good check on how we're doing in skepticism. So thank you so much.
You are welcome. You're way too kind. I'm going to buy all your drinks if I see you at SciCon.
Fantastic. I look forward to it.
Thank you, Jay.
Well,
thank you, everybody.
So to our remaining people that are still watching us, I'm going to tell you about our January speaker, who is Dr. Carl Fegans, who will be speaking about pseudo-archaeology of the horse in North America. That's going to be the second Thursday of the month. As always, that is Thursday, January 11th, 2024. The first time I've written down 2024. Another reminder, we do a virtual Skeptics in the Pub on Zoom the fourth Wednesday of every month. That's December 27th of this year. Well, thank you for attending this Bay Area Skeptics SkepTalk, and all the best through the holiday season to you and yours. And we will see you in 2024. Stay skeptical and good night.